Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
that I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States
the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. Chair.
And with that, Donald Trump takes office for his second term as the 47th President of the United States of America. And President Trump wasted no time starting to implement his agenda on day one, signing executive orders from immigration to education to energy. But one thing that Trump did not do on Monday was impose tariffs on Canada. His promise to bring across-the-board import tariffs on Canadian goods is still on the table, but when and how exactly the tariffs will come is still up in the air. So what do we know, and what don't we know about Trump 2.0? I'm David Smith, and this is The Big Story. I'm joined today by Xavier Delgado, Senior Associate with the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Hi, Xavier. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, David. Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start, since you are there in the thick of things, for our listeners here north of the border, what's the vibe like in Washington, D.C. on Inauguration Day? Is it like a party atmosphere? Is it more of a somber, serious kind of event? And is it any different this year because the whole thing had to be moved inside from the weather?
Well, if you're a Trump supporter who's flown in, it's definitely a party atmosphere. You walk around D.C., you see red hats everywhere, American flags. The downtown area is locked down for all the inauguration festivities. I think the president, at the time of recording, is just wrapping up a lunch on Capitol Hill and about to head to Capital One Arena, where he'll be signing his initial executive orders in front of the crowd that's gathered there to support him. If you're a local resident, though, you've been through a few inaugurations and you're not too into the whole political sphere, once you get outside downtown, a lot of people have just left for the long weekend. It is Martin Luther King Day today. So it's a little bit of a mix. If you're downtown in the thick of things, it's an exciting political party. If you get out to the outskirts, it's a bit quieter, but everyone is just bracing for what's going to be a very hectic and busy 100 first days of the administration.
Yes, indeed. It is going to be quite the few months here as Mr. Trump gets settled back into the White House. So the big news for Canadians today is that there is no news, at least when it comes to tariffs. What do you make of Trump holding off on the tariff threat for now? What's gone into that decision? Why might he have done that?
Well, I think that's the critical words there, David. For now, we know that he promised in his inaugural address that he'd be looking at whether he could tariff other countries, whether it's allies or adversaries like China, but that he's holding off on it for now. I wouldn't read too much into it beyond what's already been well ventilated, which is that this is going to be a priority for his administration. He's looking to extract more revenue and money for the American people out of trading partners. But if you looked at his inaugural priorities, a lot of it is more inward facing. He's looking to increase government efficiency. He's going to sign in a few short moments a slew of executive orders that's going to take aim at some of the government agencies we have here in Washington. And he's also looking towards the southern border, which was a large electoral issue for the people who got him into office. So I think the initial priorities for the first at least 24 hours are going to be primarily domestic. But I wouldn't take for granted the fact that he's likely in the coming days and weeks going to start looking more seriously at whether he can tariff allies and how he'd go about doing that.
Yeah, in his inauguration address, he did reference again the creation of something called an external revenue service. What would that be exactly? How does that fit into the puzzle here?
I think it's something that we're going to have to just wait and see in the coming days. I think it's important to note that the United States already does have the authority and the ability to enact and implement tariffs. So it's unclear whether this new agency would take on that responsibility from the existing authorities that have that mandate. But really, when it comes to things like the External Revenue Service, the Department of Government Efficiency, these are new initiatives being launched by the Trump administration. And anybody who tells you outside the president's circle that they know what's happening is probably lying to you. These are novel ideas that are being implemented, and only those in the closest inner circles of the White House have any sense of the blueprint on how these are going to be rolled out.
Okay. Now, you work, Xavier, in the world of promotion of Canada and knowledge of Canada within the United States. What has your experience been over the last month or so when it comes to how people in Washington are reacting to the very idea of across-the-board tariffs? What is the reaction that you're hearing? What are the concerns down there?
Well, one of the persistent concerns we have in the Canada-US space here on the state side is that oftentimes Americans just don't think about Canada. They'll think about us when we beat them in gold medal hockey, or they'll think about us every now and again if some issue pops up remotely here or there. But across the board, day to day, Americans aren't really thinking about Canada. And that also extends to lawmakers. There's a really great American-Canadian Economic and Security Caucus composed of members of both the House and the Senate from both sides of the aisle. They've been great on advocating for Canada-US issues. There's also a Northern Border Security Caucus that's entirely Republican-led and run that focuses on Northern Border security issues. But I think it's important to note that lawmakers, especially those at the highest levels of government here in D.C., have a lot of other things to focus on. And it's hard to get airtime for a country that's often not a squeaky wheel like Canada is. So part of the battle here has been really educating and trying to draw attention to Canada so that when these issues pop up, people aren't just flying in blindly or ignorantly with no understanding of how the Canada-US trade relationship worked. I think that's been a big part of public diplomacy for the Canadian government over the past few weeks. We've seen a concerted effort to communicate down here in D.C. the benefits of Canada-US trade. In fact, if you're watching the National Football Playoff Championship tonight on any of their local broadcasters, there's a chance that you'll see an advertisement for Ontario that touts the Ontario-US trade relationship. So we've seen a big uptick in that form of public diplomacy, really just trying to educate people about what the status of the Canada-US relationship is and all the benefits that it brings to people across the country.
Yeah, I know we are still working in the world of crystal balls and speculation about what or what might not happen. Nobody's inside President Trump's head. But would you say there's a possibility that when these tariffs do come, if they do come, is there a chance that they won't be across the board? Do you think the administration is at least open to negotiating ahead of time some exemptions for some Canadian sectors?
Well, the president not president-elect anymore. President Trump loves to say that nothing is off the table. I think he's playing his cards very closely to his chest, not just because this was a campaign promise he made, but also with an eye to the 2026 USMCA review. It's a massive trilateral agreement. It helps facilitate billions of dollars in trade for all three countries. And I think the president is going to try to use the threat of tariffs, especially across the board universal tariffs, to negotiate a better position for the United States within the agreement. We know that they're unhappy with Canada's digital services tax. I think that might be a chip that they try and play. But I don't think that we're going to get any indication from the president about whether he's going to take universal tariffs off the board, whether he's going to try and narrow it down to specific sectors. I think they'll try and keep the threat of it as large as possible so that they have a better hand as we head into these renegotiations.
The news cycle here in Canada has been totally preoccupied with how the government is responding, what that response specifically might look like once it comes about. Where does Canada have leverage over the U.S. when it comes to trade and possible counter tariffs?
It's a great question, David, because I think there's almost this myth of Canadian leverage. Now, it's worth noting Canada is one of the United States' largest trading partners. I think if you count goods and services, we're the top. If you just count goods, we're second behind Mexico. So, and Canada is the leading trading partner for, I think, something around 34 U.S. states, the largest export market. So Canada is a big buyer of U.S. goods. There's a lot of money that flows both ways across the border. Canada could use targeted tariffs to try and hit certain parts of the US economy that would be very painful for the Republican White House. Now, that being said, in doing so, they would likely also increase prices for Canadians, incur significant economic costs at home. And that's why I say this myth of Canadian leverage, because although Canada does have the means to hurt the US economy, it can't really do so without also hurting Canadian consumers. And especially with the political climate in Canada right now, of course, in the wake of Justin Trudeau's resignation, with unclear status about the future of the Liberal Party and when we'll head to a federal election, where the state of the economy is expected to be one of the leading factors driving voters to the polls. I'm not sure exactly to the extent Canada can leverage that economic toolbox to hit back at the United States. Although it certainly does help that the first ministers seem to be across the board relatively united in standing up to U.S. tariffs.
Yeah, if I could ask you about the Danielle Smith factor, how is that being received? Is that as big a deal in terms of a show of unity or disunity? Is that hampering Canada's position as much as some people may be suggesting?
Well, I think in any case, a unified front to the extent that it's possible would be the best situation for Canada. Danielle Smith standing out on energy exports, I think she's in a tough spot right now because energy is so crucial as an economic lifeline for Alberta. And even just putting it on the table could have economic ramifications for the workers working in the oil fields and the oil sands and in the energy sector. So as the Premier of Alberta, she's in a tough position. But as someone who is trying to step up and be a leader on the federal and national level, I don't think it helps that there's some disunity between the first ministers on what they're willing to put on the table to respond to the United States. But that being said, they'll have a lot of time to work it out. It seems the fact that tariffs aren't being enacted on Trump's first day in office gives Canada a little bit more runway than I think the federal government was expecting. And if they can continue to pull together and unify between all the first ministers, the provinces, the federal government, even the cities and the local authorities, there's a chance that we can get a really strong Team Canada response that was lacking in the run-up to the 2024 presidential election.
Yeah, another question that I do have on the timeline of this whole thing, and you mentioned it, the uncertain future of the Liberal government in Canada. We are going to have an election at some point in 2025. What kinds of conversations happen between the government of Canada and a new U.S. administration, given that our government could very well be on its way out? Is there any sense on the Trump administration side of things was, well, we should really just wait until the new government of Canada is in place because these people we're talking to now might not be around in a few months? Is that a factor at all?
I think it's definitely a factor. And again, the Trump administration, especially those that relate to foreign affairs, are going to have a lot of conversations in the coming weeks, not just with North America, but also the situation in the Middle East, tying up the situation in Eastern Europe with Russia and Ukraine, starting a reset of relations in the Indo-Pacific to counter China. Canada is on the list of priorities, but I don't think it's going to be the top priority in the first few days of the new administration. That being said, the fact that Canada seems to be in a bit of a disarray certainly does impact things. This is something I didn't realize until a few days after the Prime Minister had stepped down, David. But if we say that the first 100 days, as is conventional wisdom here in Washington, are the most important for a presidential term because of the momentum they have, because they work really hard to get their first priorities out of the way early on. Out of those first 100 days, for about 65 of them, Canada is going to be in a Peru parliament. So we have no legislature, and we have a lame duck prime minister who's already said he's going to resign. And then if we have maybe the fastest election timeline possible, where say March 25th, the day after Parliament comes back, they enter an election period, and then we have the election on April 30th, which I think is the earliest date that you could have it. That's exactly 100 days. So we'll spend the entirety of the first 100 days of President Trump's term in office trying to sort out domestic politics in Canada. It's really not a great position for Canada to be in negotiating with an administration that's frankly skeptical of the value that they're getting out of the Canada-U.S. relationship.
Very interesting. Okay, thank you for that. And in the interim, what role does the business community itself play in these trade disputes, in influencing the movers and shakers? Tariffs obviously hurt businesses on both sides of the border, whether it's tariffs on one side or both sides. So how much can industry leaders really impact the way that these negotiations may play out?
Well, tariffs do impact trade and it impacts business on both sides of the border. But David, so does uncertainty. And whether it's uncertainty brought about by questions about what the Trump administration is going to do, although I think in the coming days that'll be sorted out and we'll get a clear sense of direction from the government on what their trade priorities are going to be. Or it's uncertainty in Ottawa, unsure who's going to be prime minister in 2 months, whether that prime minister will stick around for the duration of their year or whether we'll have an early election, and then what the next government is going to do. All of these questions impact the business community. But they soldier on. We know that business advocates are here in Washington, D.C., trying to spread awareness about aspects of the bilateral trade relationship that are beneficial. The auto industry, of course, is one of those foundational pillars of Canada-U.S. trade. I know their representatives are here in Washington right now. I think education is going to be a really big role for the business community, talking to legislators here in D.C. and explaining how their business, A, impacts consumers and workers in congressional districts in states, in jurisdictions where elected officials should be paying attention. But also B, just more broadly, strengthens the country and strengthens the region so we can have a North America that's competitive with the rest of the world.
So to tie a bow on it for today, I started the episode by asking, what do we know and what don't we know after Trump's inauguration? There seems to be a lot more that we don't know than we do know. It's the nature of the beast. What will you be watching for in coming days and weeks in this first 100-day period when it comes to Trump's communication, the communications of his administration, and his posture on the trade file? Are there any key items you're going to be looking for?
I'm going to be keeping a close eye, David, on when we can get a nomination hearing for Trump's Trump's nominee to be the ambassador of the U.S. to Canada, Pete Huckstra. He's a former Michigan representative, formerly a U.S. ambassador during the first Trump administration. But as a former Northern Border representative, he knows the Canada-U.S. relationship really well. In fact, it's his lived experience. So I'm really curious to see when his confirmation hearing comes up. And during that confirmation hearing, how he addresses some of the questions about the United States' relationship with Canada. I'll be keeping an eye out to see in the coming days whether the administration starts talking about defense spending. It's been a long time issue for Canada. Every communique, whether it's from Danielle Smith or the rest of the first ministers or anyone else in the federal government, has acknowledged that Canada's inability to spend 2% of its GDP on defense, which it has previously committed to at the Vilnius Summit and the Wales Summit for NATO, is going to be a problem with this new administration, which has already been skeptical of Canada's contributions to the alliance. So I'll keep an eye out for that. But I think above all, I'm just going to try and follow as closely as possible as the president starts to enact policy in the coming days. Of course, the executive orders are one thing, but also keeping an eye on social media. He's well known to launch policy discussions on social media. He's on Truth Social. He's back on Twitter. I think he's going to be back on Facebook and certainly some of the other platforms that are out there. We'll start to see more of a Trump administration presence. Just keeping abreast of policy updates that might come from there, because this really is an administration that likes to launch these discussions online at any moment's notice.
Okay, that is very interesting. So for listeners who want to stay up to date with the very latest, go right to the source. Keep an eye on Donald Trump's social media channels. Yeah, that's very interesting as well. All right, Xavier Delgado, thank you so much for your time today. Really interesting conversation. Hopefully we can connect again as we continue to follow the first 100 days of the Trump 2.0 administration. Thank you again.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it.
And again, that was Xavier Delgado, an expert on the Canada-U.S. relationship and senior associate at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Canada Institute, a policy research institute on Canadian affairs based in Washington, D.C. And that was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on any of your other favorite podcast platforms. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm David Smith. Thank you for listening.